Welcome. Find a comfortable position and let your body settle. There is nothing left to do tonight. No decisions to make, no problems to solve. Just this, the sound of a voice and a story and the slow and gentle arrival of sleep. Tonight we are going somewhere different. Somewhere old. A world that some believe was buried on purpose, and that has been waiting patiently to be remembered. Let your eyes close. And let us begin. Let your eyes grow heavy now. Let the weight of the day begin to dissolve, from your shoulders, your chest, your hands resting open at your sides. The world you are about to enter is one that some believe history has buried, quietly, carefully, and with great intention. What follows is the Tartaria of legend and conspiracy, a civilization spoken of in hushed corners of the internet, traced through old maps and crumbling architecture and questions that don't quite have satisfying answers. We are not here to argue for it or against it. We are here to tell its story as its believers tell it, slowly, gently, with all the wonder it deserves. Breathe in. Let your body grow heavy. And let us begin. The civilization known as Tartaria, or, in the grandest telling of its story, the Great Tartarian Empire, is said to have been one of the largest and most advanced empires in human history. On maps printed in Europe from the 15th through the 18th century, the name Tartaria appears again and again, sprawling across vast stretches of Asia and beyond in letters so large they dwarf the kingdoms around them. These are real maps held in real archives. The name is genuinely there. And for those who believe in the empire's hidden greatness, that cartographic presence is not a geographical label but a memory, the faint outline of something enormous that was once fully known, and was then, somehow, forgotten. The capital of this lost civilization, according to some who study it, was a city of extraordinary beauty, a place of wide, clean avenues lined with buildings of a scale and elegance that the official history of their era cannot quite explain. Some believers point to the old maps and name this capital Tartary, or Siberia Ulterior, or simply the great city at the heart of the world. Others look at photographs of 19th-century buildings in cities like Chicago, St. Louis, and San Francisco, buildings that were demolished, they say, too quickly and too completely, and see in their soaring arched ceilings and their elaborate stone facades the fingerprints of a civilization that predates the one we have been taught. The city in this telling is everywhere and nowhere, hidden in plain sight. The Tartarian Empire, as its believers describe it, was not built through conquest in the ordinary sense. It did not rise by force of arms alone. What held it together, they say, was something more subtle and more powerful. A technology of energy, free, wireless, drawn from the earth and the air itself, that allowed its builders to raise structures of impossible grandeur without the cranes, the steam engines, the armies of laborers that conventional history requires for such tasks. This technology is the great secret at the heart of the Tartaria theory. And it begins, as so many great secrets do, with a name that some of you will recognize: Nikola Tesla. For Tesla, the believers say, did not invent wireless electricity. He rediscovered it. Tesla's famous Wardenclyffe Tower, that strange, mushroom-shaped structure he built on Long Island in the early 20th century, intended to transmit electrical power through the air without wires, was, in the Tartarian telling, not an experiment but a reconstruction. Tesla had found, somewhere in his years of research, evidence of a prior civilization that had already solved the problem of free energy. The towers of Tartaria, they say, are still standing, hiding in plain sight as church steeples, as old stone columns, as the ornate copper-topped spires of the grand buildings of the 19th century. They were not decorative. They were functional. They were the antennas of a civilization that powered its world the way we power our phones, wirelessly, invisibly, and everywhere at once. The mud flood is one of the most striking and quietly unsettling ideas in the Tartaria theory. Believers point to a peculiar pattern in the architecture of old European and American cities. buildings whose ground floors are buried. Walk through the old quarters of certain cities, Edinburgh, Prague, parts of Central Asia, and you can find first-floor windows that sit barely above the current street level, basement rooms that feel, in their proportions, as though they were once the main floor, entrances that seem to have been excavated rather than simply built low. The explanation offered by conventional historians involves shifting urban fill, gradual accumulation of debris, centuries of rebuilding. The Tartarian explanation is different. There was a flood, not of water but of mud. A catastrophic event, perhaps a century or two ago. And the civilization that existed before it was buried, almost completely, beneath the earth. The timeline of this buried civilization is one of the most contested and fascinating aspects of the Tartaria theory. The believers do not, for the most part, place Tartaria in the deep ancient past, not alongside Egypt or Mesopotamia, not 10,000 years ago. They place it much closer, a few centuries at most. The great Tartarian civilization, in this telling, fell not in the distant darkness of prehistory, but within living memory of the industrial age. Its ruins are not buried under thousands of years of sediment. They are buried under a single catastrophic event and a sustained, deliberate erasure. An erasure so thorough and so recent that the people who carried it out may have been the great-great-grandparents of people alive today. The architectural evidence, as the believers see it, is everywhere. The grand buildings of the 19th century, the railway stations, the World's Fair pavilions, the city halls and opera houses of Europe and America, are too large, too ornate, too technically ambitious for a civilization that, in the official account, had only recently industrialized. Who built them? With what workforce and what tools and in what impossible time frames? The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the famous White City, was constructed, according to the official record, in just 2 years, its enormous plaster buildings gleaming white in the Illinois sun. 2 years. The believers look at photographs of those vast and elaborate structures and ask a simple question: how? And in the silence where a satisfying answer should be, they place Tartaria. The Tartarian people themselves, as imagined by the theory's adherents, were a civilization of considerable sophistication and beauty. They are described as a tall, graceful people. Some accounts give them reddish or golden hair, pale or olive skin, a bearing that photographs from certain old archives seem to believers to capture. They did not worship in the way that history records. Their spiritual tradition was connected, the theory suggests, to the free energy that powered their world. A reverence for the electromagnetic force of the earth, expressed in the soaring copper spires of their architecture, in the intricate geometric patterns that recur in the decorative stonework of old buildings from Moscow to Manhattan. Their culture was, in the telling of its believers, global. Not because they conquered the world but because they inhabited it, fully, beautifully, and for a very long time. And then, somewhere in the 19th century, the exact date varies depending on who is telling the story, something happened. An event so catastrophic, so complete, and so rapidly covered over that within a single generation, the civilization it destroyed had been not merely defeated but forgotten. The survivors, if the theory is correct, woke into a world that was already being rebuilt around a different story, a story in which the grand buildings they stood inside had been constructed by the civilization that was now emerging to replace Tartaria, rather than inherited from the one that had just been destroyed. History in this telling is not a record. It is a replacement. A new story told so loudly and so consistently that the old one simply fell silent. Let those images settle now. The wide avenues. The soaring copper spires. The mud lying still and deep over a world that was. You don't need to believe any of it. You only need to let it wash over you, like the story that was almost forgotten. Feel yourself grow heavier. The mystery holds you gently. And you are drifting, softly drifting, into the long and buried story of a world that some believe was lost on purpose. The night deepens now. Your breath slows. Somewhere, a copper spire catches the last of the evening light, rising above a city that has forgotten what it is standing in. We continue our journey, not forward through time but downward through it, deeper into the layers of what the believers say was taken from us. Let yourself sink a little further. And listen. The event that ended Tartaria is known in the community of its believers simply as the reset. It was not, they say, a natural disaster in any ordinary sense. Not a volcano, not an earthquake, not the slow erosion of a civilization grown too large to sustain itself. It was deliberate. A controlled demolition of an entire world, carried out by forces whose identity the believers debate endlessly but whose existence they do not doubt. The reset was the moment the page was turned. And everything written on the previous page was, as far as the new authors were concerned, to be permanently obscured. The evidence for the reset, as its believers read it, is written into the cities themselves. Not in what is there but in what is missing. The grand buildings of the Tartarian age, those vast, technically bewildering structures of the 19th century, share a peculiar characteristic. Their lower floors are buried, their foundations inexplicably deep, their basement windows level with the street as though the street itself has risen around them. In city after city, from St. Petersburg to San Francisco, from Buenos Aires to Budapest, the same pattern repeats. The ground came up. The buildings stayed where they were. And the new civilization built its streets at the new level and called the buried floors storage, and called the old entrances service doors, and did not ask too many questions about what lay beneath. The orphan trains are one of the most haunting threads in the Tartaria story. Between roughly 1854 and 1929, a program operated in the United States in which tens of thousands of children, many of them described as orphans, foundlings, children without family or documented origin, were transported by rail from the cities of the East to farming communities across the Midwest and West, where they were placed with families who needed labor and, sometimes, offered something like love. The official history describes this as a well-meaning if imperfect social welfare program. The Tartarian reading is darker. These children, the believers say, were not orphans in the conventional sense. They were the survivors, the children of Tartaria, separated from a civilization that had just been destroyed, their origins obscured, their history erased along with everything else, distributed across a new country that was being populated and organized from scratch. The question of population is central to the reset theory. Where did the people come from? The millions of settlers who filled the cities and towns of 19th-century America and Australia and other newly colonized territories with such remarkable speed. The official answer involves immigration, high birth rates, and the movement of peoples across continents. The Tartarian answer is different. The territories were not empty before the settlers arrived. They were inhabited by the remnants of a civilization that had just been catastrophically reduced. And the new populations were not simply immigrants. They were, in part, a managed replacement, People brought in to fill a world that had been cleared, given a new history and told to begin again. The star forts are among the most visually striking pieces of evidence cited by Tartaria believers. Scattered across Europe, the Americas, North Africa and Asia, these extraordinary geometric fortifications, their plans radiating outward in perfect symmetrical points, like stone flowers or iron snowflakes, were built, according to official history, as military installations designed to deflect cannon fire. The believers look at them differently. The geometry is too perfect, they say. The scale is too ambitious. And the distribution is too global, too consistent in its form across cultures and continents that were not, in the official account, in contact with one another. The star forts in the Tartarian reading were not military. They were energy installations, nodes in the global free energy network, their pointed geometry designed not to deflect cannonballs but to direct and distribute the electromagnetic current that powered Tartarian civilization. The role of the Tartarian church, or rather, of the buildings that are now called churches, is another recurring theme. The believers note that the great cathedrals and basilicas of Europe, and the elaborate religious buildings of the 19th century in America, share architectural features with what they identify as Tartarian construction. The copper spires, the resonant domed ceilings, the elaborate pipe organs whose sound fills the body as much as the ears. These buildings were not, in the Tartarian telling, originally built for Christian worship. They were built as what we might call energy centers, places where the free energy of the earth was concentrated, where the electromagnetic properties of the architecture itself produced effects on the human body and mind that the builders understood and intended. The religion came later, moving into spaces it had not built and claiming them as its own. The language of Tartaria is another mystery the believers trace. Across the old maps, the names of Tartarian regions and cities share a peculiar consistency. Syllables and roots that recur across geographies too distant to have shared a linguistic tradition in the official account. The believers see in these recurring sounds the remnants of a global language or something close to one. A tongue spoken across the vast extent of the Tartarian world, fragmented by the reset into the many languages we now have, the way a mirror dropped on stone becomes 100 separate pieces, each reflecting a different angle of the same original image. And through all of it, the buried buildings and the orphan trains and the star forts and the lost language, the believers return always to the same central feeling. The feeling that the world is older than they have been told and stranger, and that somewhere beneath the official story, beneath the textbooks and the museums and the confident assertions of the history they were taught in school, something is waiting. Patient and buried and not entirely gone. That feeling is not proof of anything. But it is, for the people who carry it, entirely real. Rest now. The star forts glow faintly in the dark of the countryside, their geometry too perfect for the moonlight to ignore. The copper spires hum with something that might be wind and might be more than wind. And you are sinking, gently, completely, into the deep and quiet layers of a sleep that holds you as carefully as the earth holds everything it has ever been given. Let us continue. You are still here, still breathing, and that is enough. Let your thoughts drift past like clouds. You don't need to hold any of them. The empire continues to reveal itself, layer by layer, the way the earth reveals its strata to those patient enough to look. We are going deeper now. Into the stone. Into the detail. Into the buildings themselves. Come. The believers in Tartaria spend a great deal of time looking at buildings. Not the buildings of the ancient world, not the pyramids or the Parthenon or the ruins of Rome, but buildings that are, in the official account, merely old. Buildings from the 1800s. Buildings that are still standing in cities people walk through every day without a second glance. And what they see when they look carefully is a consistency of style and ambition and technical achievement that the official story of those centuries cannot, they say, adequately explain. The same arched windows. The same elaborate cornices. The same proportions, repeated from St. Petersburg to Sao Paulo, from Edinburgh to Melbourne, as though drawn from a single pattern book by builders who shared not just a style but a source. The Tartarian architectural tradition, as the believers reconstruct it, was built around a principle they call the living building. The structures of Tartaria were not inert. They were not simply shelter from the rain and the cold. They were designed to interact with the electromagnetic field of the earth, to channel and amplify the free energy that the civilization ran on. The materials were chosen for their conductive properties. Copper for the spires, certain granites and limestones for the walls, specific geometric ratios in the proportions of rooms and doorways that the believers compare to the ratios found in nature, in the spiral of a shell, in the branching of a river delta, in the growth pattern of a crystal. The building was, in this telling, a machine. A beautiful, inhabited, humming machine. The domes of the Tartarian world are a particular obsession among its researchers. The great domed buildings of the 19th century, state capitals, opera houses, railway terminals, libraries, are, in the official account, inspired by the classical tradition, by the Pantheon of Rome and the Dome of Brunelleschi in Florence. The believers agree that there is an inspiration at work. But they locate it differently. The domes, they say, are not decorative homages to antiquity. They are functional. A dome of the right material and the right proportion, placed over a space of the right dimensions, acts as an accumulator, gathering the free energy of the atmosphere and concentrating it within the space below. The people who sat beneath those domes were not merely attending concerts or legislative sessions. They were, whether they knew it or not, being bathed in a field of energy that Tartarian science understood and the civilization that replaced it did not. The question of who carried out the reset, who made the decision to end Tartaria and build a new world on its ruins, is the most contested and most carefully hedged aspect of the theory. The believers are generally reluctant to name a specific group, not out of caution but out of genuine uncertainty. Some point to a network of banking families who appear, in various forms, throughout the financial history of the 19th century. Others point to certain royal houses, or to organizations whose names are familiar from other conspiracy traditions. What they agree on is the shape of the answer rather than its specific content. A small group of people, possessed of knowledge about the Tartarian system that the general population did not share, who understood what they were destroying and chose to destroy it anyway, because the free energy of Tartaria was incompatible with a world organized around the ownership and sale of resources. The suppression of free energy is the hinge on which the entire Tartaria theory turns. If Tartaria had solved the problem of energy, if its towers and its domes and its copper spires had genuinely provided free wireless power to everyone within their range, then the civilization that replaced it had not merely conquered a people. It had stolen a gift. It had taken from humanity something that would have changed everything. The ability to heat a home, to light a city, to power a machine without paying anyone for the privilege. The world we live in, built on coal and oil and the metered sale of electricity, is in the Tartarian reading not progress. It is a step backward, deliberately engineered by people for whom free energy was not a blessing but a threat. The rivers and waterways of the old Tartarian world play a role in the theory that is easy to overlook. The believers note that the great rivers of Europe and America were, in the 19th century, lined with elaborate structures, mills, pumping stations, ornate bridges, that were, in many cases, demolished or allowed to decay within decades of their construction. Why build something so elaborate and destroy it so quickly? The Tartarian answer is that these structures were not mills in any simple sense. They were part of the energy infrastructure, water-powered elements of the same global system that the spires and domes served from above. The river was not just a source of mechanical power. It was a conductor. And when the reset came, the conductors were among the first things dismantled. The animals of the Tartarian world appear, in the theory, in an unexpected place. The zoological illustrations of the 18th and 19th centuries. The believers point to engravings and paintings from this period depicting creatures that do not appear in the fossil record and are not recognized by modern zoology, large, peculiar, magnificent animals that some researchers in the Tartaria community believe were real inhabitants of the pre-reset world, now extinct, their existence quietly removed from the natural history that was written after the event. The world before the reset was, in this telling, not just architecturally different. It was ecologically different. A different world, more fully alive, now reduced to the version we inherited. And the sky itself, in the Tartaria theory, was different. Not the color, not that kind of different, but its relationship to the ground. The free energy of the Tartarian system moved between earth and atmosphere in ways that the believers say produced visible effects. A luminosity in certain weather conditions, an aurora-like shimmer over the great energy centers, a quality of light in old paintings and daguerreotypes that artists and photographers have noted without being able to explain. The world was lit, in this telling, from within as much as from above. And when the towers went dark, something left the sky that has not returned. The domes are quiet now. The rivers run without their old purpose, unknowing. And somewhere in a painting in a museum you have probably walked past without stopping, an animal stands in a landscape that looks almost familiar and not quite right, the light falling on it from a direction the sun does not take. Rest. The mystery is patient. It has been waiting a very long time. And so can you. Deeper now. Each breath carries you further from the day, further into the quiet. The world the believers describe stretches around us in every direction. East to the Pacific shore, west to the Atlantic, north to the great frozen plains, south to deserts that were, perhaps, once something else entirely. It is vast, and it is old, and it is, in the telling of its researchers, only partially visible to us. We go into the archives tonight. Into the maps. Come. The maps are where most people first encounter Tartaria, and they are genuinely strange. Pull up a map of the world printed in Amsterdam in 1665, or in London in 1710, or in Paris in 1739, and there it is, Tartaria. Not a small region, not a marginal notation, but a name printed in letters as large as those used for Asia itself, sprawling across the northern and central portions of the continent in a way that suggests not a vague tribal territory but a recognized political entity. A place with a name that cartographers across Europe agreed upon, regardless of their nationality or the political allegiances of their patrons. The believers ask a simple question about these maps. If Tartaria was merely a loose collection of nomadic tribes, as the official history now describes it, why did every serious mapmaker in Europe treat it as a coherent and significant civilization for 3 centuries? The mapmakers of the early modern period were not casual artists. They were precise, competitive, commercially motivated professionals whose reputations depended on accuracy. A map that named a fiction would not sell. A map that omitted a major political reality would be corrected by rivals. The persistence of Tartaria on European maps from the 15th through the 18th century is, in the believer's reading, not a cartographic convention lazily repeated. It is evidence. Evidence that something was there, something large enough and organized enough to be worth naming, worth delineating, worth acknowledging as a power in the world. And then, across the span of the 19th century, it disappeared from the maps. Not gradually. Not as a region slowly subdivided and renamed. It simply stopped being named. As though an agreement had been reached in the cartographic community to stop mentioning it. The Tartarian flag is a detail that the believers find particularly compelling. Across multiple historical sources, European diplomatic records, travelers' accounts, early engravings, a flag is described or depicted that is associated with the Tartarian realm. A black background bearing a golden griffin, wings raised, one claw extended. The griffin, that ancient hybrid of eagle and lion, appears across an enormous range of cultures and historical periods, from ancient Persia to medieval Europe to the decorative stonework of 19th-century American buildings. The believers see in this recurrence not a coincidence of mythology but a symbol carried forward, the emblem of Tartaria, persisting in the decorative traditions of the civilization that replaced it, the way a watermark persists in paper long after the original document has been destroyed. The Romanov connection is a thread that runs through many versions of the Tartaria theory. The Romanov dynasty, which ruled Russia from 1613 until the Revolution of 1917, occupied a territory that overlapped substantially with what the maps called Tartaria. Some believers argue that the Romanovs were not conquerors of Tartarian lands but inheritors of a Tartarian tradition, that the Russian imperial court, with its extraordinary architectural ambitions, its obsession with gold and ornament, its construction of cities of a scale and grandeur that seemed to exceed the resources officially available to it, was in some sense a continuation of the Tartarian system under a new name. St. Petersburg, built by Peter the Great in the early 18th century on supposedly empty marshland, is a particular focus of this argument. No one, the believers say, builds a city of that size and that beauty on a marsh in that time, unless the city was already there waiting to be claimed. The role of the Tartars, the actual historical people from whom the name Tartaria derives, is a complicated one in the theory. The Tartars were real, a collection of Turkic and Mongolic peoples who inhabited the steppes of Central Asia and whose name became, in European usage, a broad and somewhat imprecise label for the peoples of the East. The believers generally do not argue that the Tartars were the Tartarians in a simple ethnic sense. Rather, they suggest that the name became attached to the region, and to the remnants of the civilization that had been there, through the contact between European explorers and the peoples they found living among the ruins of something older and grander than anything those explorers had a framework to understand. The Tartars in this reading were not the builders. They were the inheritors, people living in and around structures they had not made and could not fully explain, in the way that medieval Europeans lived among the ruins of Rome. The Silk Road, that ancient network of trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to China, runs directly through the heart of what the maps called Tartaria. The believers note that the goods which traveled the Silk Road were not merely luxuries, silk, spice, porcelain, but also ideas, technologies, and in certain periods, very large amounts of gold and silver moving in directions that the official economic history of the period does not fully account for. Where was the wealth going? Who was receiving it? The Tartarian reading suggests that the Silk Road was not merely a trade route but a tributary system, commerce flowing toward a center of gravity that the official maps acknowledged with that great sprawling name and that the official histories have since learned not to discuss. The old census records are a source of particular fascination for Tartaria researchers. In territory after territory across the 19th century, official census documents record populations dramatically lower than the infrastructure of those regions seems designed to support. Cities with water systems capable of serving hundreds of thousands of people, recorded as having populations in the tens of thousands. Road networks of a scale and quality that would only be economically justified by a density of traffic far greater than the official record suggests. The believers read these discrepancies not as administrative error but as evidence of the aftermath of a catastrophe, a world whose population had been drastically reduced by the reset, and whose infrastructure survived as a monument to a density of habitation that no longer existed. And the travelers. The great travelers of the early 19th century, the explorers and diplomats and adventurers who made their way through Central Asia and Siberia and wrote accounts that were published to considerable interest in Europe, describe in passing and without particular emphasis, things that the Tartaria researchers find extraordinary. Ruined cities of enormous size, half buried in the steppe. Roads that seemed to lead nowhere, too wide and too well made for the territory they crossed. Locals who spoke of a former time with a reverence that the travelers noted and did not understand. The believers read these accounts as eyewitness testimony, descriptions, made before the erasure was complete, of a world in the process of being covered over. The archives are quiet now. The maps are rolled and shelved. The travelers have come home and written their accounts and gone to sleep in rooms whose walls, if you looked closely enough, might show you something. Rest. The records are patient. The griffin on the old flag has folded its wings. And you are drifting, down through the layers, through the sediment of official history, into something older and stranger and strangely peaceful below. You are still with us, and that is a gentle and good thing. Half the story is told. Let your breathing find its own slow rhythm. We continue now into the middle of what the believers call the hidden history, the part that lives not in the grand theories but in the small details, the overlooked corners, the things that are sitting in plain sight in museums and libraries and city streets, waiting for someone to look at them differently. Come. We are going into the details now. The believers in Tartaria are, above almost everything else, close lookers. They zoom in. They enlarge. They spend hours with photographs of old buildings, old paintings, old objects, finding in the details things that the casual eye passes over. And one of the details they return to most often is the presence of children, or rather, their absence. In the grand public spaces of the 19th century, in the photographs of the world's fairs and the newly built city halls and the gleaming railway terminals, the crowds are there. The adults are there. But the children are sparse, and the believers find this strange. A world that was genuinely thriving and populous would show its children in its public spaces. The relative absence of children in these images is, for the researchers, another trace of the aftermath. A population still recovering from a catastrophe, still too reduced to fill the spaces it had inherited. The world's fairs deserve more attention than the official history gives them. Between 1851 and the early 20th century, a series of extraordinary international exhibitions were held in cities across Europe and America. London, Paris, Chicago, Philadelphia, St. Louis, each one featuring buildings of a scale and grandeur that strained the official account of how quickly and cheaply they were constructed. The Crystal Palace in London. The White City in Chicago. The Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, which was the only building from the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition to be preserved, because the people of the city refused to let it be demolished. The believers ask why these buildings were demolished at all. Buildings of that quality and ambition, constructed at that expense, are not normally torn down within years of their completion. They are maintained. They become institutions. The rapid and systematic demolition of the World's Fair buildings is, in the Tartarian reading, not an architectural decision. It is evidence removal. The mud flood left traces in unexpected places. The believers point to old paintings and engravings of cities that show street levels noticeably higher than those depicted in images made just decades earlier, a rise that the official record attributes to urban fill and construction debris, but that the researchers find too rapid and too uniform to be explained that way. They point to the discovery, in the course of various urban construction projects across Europe and America, of complete rooms and corridors, and in some cases entire building floors found perfectly preserved beneath the current street level, found with furniture, with objects, with the accumulated details of daily life, as though the people who lived there had simply walked out one day and never come back, and the mud had come in quietly behind them. These discoveries are documented. They appear in newspapers and construction records. And they are, in the official account, treated as curiosities rather than as evidence of anything larger. The Tartarian understanding of water is another thread the believers trace carefully. The great fountains of the 19th century, those elaborate public installations in city squares across Europe and America, featuring sculptures of extraordinary quality and jets of water that rose to heights requiring significant hydraulic pressure, were not, in the Tartarian reading, simply decorative. Water, in the free energy system, was a conductor and a carrier. The movement of water through the Tartarian infrastructure was part of the energy network, the way blood moves through a body, not merely transported but doing work as it travels. The great fountains were terminals. The water that rose through them had passed through systems that the civilization understood and the one that replaced it did not, and the fountains continued to flow, long after their true purpose had been forgotten, because the infrastructure that fed them was too deep and too durable to simply stop. The Tartarian approach to death and burial is a detail that the researchers find consistently strange. Across the territories identified with the Tartarian world, the burial practices recorded in the earliest post-reset documents are oddly inconsistent. Wildly different traditions existing in close geographic proximity, as though the peoples of the region had not yet settled on a shared practice, as though they were, in some sense, starting from scratch. The believers read this as the behavior of a survivor population, people who had lost their cultural continuity along with everything else, improvising rituals in the absence of the traditions that had been severed. Grief without a grammar for grief. Burial without the old understanding of what burial was for. The textile traditions of the regions associated with Tartaria are another area of quiet fascination. The intricate geometric patterns that appear in the textiles of Central Asia, of Eastern Europe, of indigenous North American cultures. Patterns that are strikingly similar across enormous distances, in cultures that the official account does not place in contact with one another, are, for the Tartaria researchers, another fragment of the original. A global visual language, preserved in weaving and embroidery long after the civilization that produced it had been dismantled, the way a song is preserved in the mouths of people who no longer remember where they learned it or what the words originally meant. The medical knowledge of the pre-reset world is hinted at, the believers say, in the anomalous sophistication of certain ancient and medieval medical texts. Documents that describe surgical procedures, pharmacological compounds, and anatomical understandings that seem to exceed what the official timeline of medical history would predict. The believers do not claim that Tartarian medicine was magical. They claim it was advanced, the product of a civilization that had been accumulating knowledge for longer than the official history acknowledges, and that some of that knowledge survived the reset in fragmentary form, embedded in texts whose true origin was obscured along with everything else. And the music. The great pipe organs of the European cathedrals, those enormous, architecturally integrated instruments whose sound fills the body as much as the ears, are, in the Tartarian reading, not merely musical instruments. They are resonance devices. The frequencies they produce interact with the architectural properties of the spaces they inhabit in ways that the builders of those spaces understood and intended. The effect of sitting inside a great cathedral while a pipe organ plays is not accidental. It is the last functioning remnant of a technology that the Tartarian civilization used deliberately: sound as a force, frequency as a tool, the human body as a receiver tuned to respond to what the building and the instrument together produced. The organ fades. The last note hangs in the stone air of a building whose true purpose no one living remembers. The fountains run on outside, patient and purposeful and beautiful, doing their old work in the dark. And you are very still now, very heavy, the day entirely gone from you. Rest. The details will keep. They have kept this long. Almost 1 hour has passed. Can you feel it? The deep, soft weight of genuine rest beginning to gather in your limbs? You are doing beautifully. Simply staying here, breathing, listening. The story continues, and you don't need to hold on to any of it. Just let it drift through you like warm water through old stone. Tonight we are going into the lives of the people who looked too closely. The ones who asked the wrong questions in the wrong rooms. Come. Every theory needs its researchers, and the Tartaria theory has produced a community of them. People who spend their days in the digital archives of old newspapers, in the photograph collections of regional libraries, in the comment sections of videos that have been viewed millions of times by people who found them at 2 in the morning and could not stop watching. They are not, for the most part, academics. They are mechanics and nurses and retired teachers and college students and parents of young children who became curious about a buried window and followed the curiosity wherever it led. The believers do not see this as a weakness of the theory. They see it as evidence of something important, that the official institutions of knowledge have failed to ask these questions, and so the questions have been asked by everyone else. The suppression of inconvenient historians is a recurring theme in the Tartaria community. The believers point to scholars and writers of the 19th and early 20th centuries who published works that touched on anomalies in the official historical timeline, who noted the inexplicable sophistication of certain ruins, the discrepancies in the population records, the architectural inconsistencies that the mainstream account could not explain, and who were subsequently ignored, discredited, or simply allowed to disappear from the canon of serious historical inquiry. Their books went out of print. Their papers were not cited. Their names became obscure. The believers do not always claim that this suppression was active and coordinated. Sometimes they say, it is simply the way institutions work, the slow gravitational pull of consensus, drawing everything that contradicts it into irrelevance. The role of the Smithsonian Institution in the Tartaria theory is a significant one. The Smithsonian, founded in 1846 and now the world's largest museum and research complex, is accused by some Tartaria researchers of being not merely a repository of history but an active manager of it, an institution whose collecting and cataloging practices have, whether by design or by the unconscious operation of its founding assumptions, systematically excluded or obscured evidence of pre-reset civilization. The specific claim varies depending on who is making it. Some point to reports of anomalously large human skeletons, allegedly discovered in the 19th century and submitted to the Smithsonian, which then disappeared from the record. Others point to artifacts of uncertain origin and extraordinary sophistication that the institution has classified in ways that place them within the official timeline rather than outside it. The Smithsonian in this telling is not a window onto the past. It is a carefully managed view. The giant skeleton reports are among the most persistent and widely circulated elements of the broader alternative history community, and they appear in the Tartaria theory in a specific form. The Tartarian people, some believers claim, were not merely culturally and technologically advanced. They were physically different. Larger than modern humans, taller, more robust, possessed of a physiology that reflected the different energetic environment they inhabited. The reports of anomalously large skeletons, found in burial mounds across North America and in various locations in Europe and Asia during the 19th century, are read by these researchers as physical evidence of this difference. The skeletons were found. They were documented in local newspapers. And then they were collected and catalogued and quietly ceased to be mentioned. The timeline of the official historical narrative is, for the Tartaria researchers, one of the most vulnerable points of the mainstream account. The system of historical dating, the framework that places ancient Egypt at a certain number of years before the Common Era, that assigns specific centuries to specific events, that creates the confident chronology taught in schools, is, they argue, more constructed than it appears. The believers point to the work of certain revisionist historians and chronologists who have argued, using astronomical and textual evidence, that the conventional timeline contains errors of centuries, that events assigned to ancient history may in fact be considerably more recent, and that the apparent depth of the past has been exaggerated to create distance between the present civilization and its immediate predecessor. If the reset happened in the 19th century, and if the timeline has been extended to place it further back, then what we call ancient history may in some cases be a disguised account of something much closer to us in time. The role of language in maintaining the official story is a thread the believers trace with particular care. The words we use to describe history, words like ancient, medieval, primitive, prehistoric, carry within them assumptions about the direction of human development, about the relationship between age and sophistication, about what it means for something to be old. These words, the Tartaria researchers argue, are not neutral. They encode a worldview in which civilization moves in one direction only, from simple to complex, from ignorant to knowledgeable, from primitive to advanced. A civilization that was advanced before the official timeline says it should have been is, within this linguistic framework, almost literally unthinkable. The language itself becomes a kind of architecture, a structure that makes certain thoughts easy and others very difficult, that shapes what questions can be asked and which answers can be taken seriously. The followers of the Tartaria theory are, many of them, people who describe a particular experience of awakening, a moment when the first anomaly they encountered cracked something open in their understanding of the world, and the questions began to come faster than the official answers could satisfy them. They describe this experience with a consistency that the researchers find significant. The same sequence of discovery, the same feeling of pieces falling into place, the same mixture of excitement and unease that comes with believing you have seen something true that you were not supposed to see. Whether that experience reflects genuine insight or the seductive pattern-making of a mind that has decided what it wants to find, the believers do not doubt. They were standing in front of a buried window and they looked down and they saw a room below the street. And they have not been able to stop looking since. And the children of the reset, those orphan train riders, those undocumented foundlings, those children without histories, grew up and had children of their own, and those children had children, and the generations accumulated until the people alive today are, in the Tartarian reckoning, 4 or 5 or 6 generations removed from the catastrophe. Far enough that the memory is gone. Close enough that the bones of the old world are still visible if you know where to look. The researchers believe that many people alive today are the biological descendants of Tartarians, that the blood of the old civilization runs in modern veins, carrying no conscious memory but perhaps something subtler. A vague unease with the official story, a persistent feeling that the world is not quite what it claims to be, a tendency to stop in front of old buildings and look up at the copper spires and feel, without knowing why, that something has been lost. The archives close for the night. The researchers go home to their ordinary lives, carrying their extraordinary questions with them. And you are already more than halfway there. The questions don't need answers tonight. They can rest the way everything rests in the long and patient dark. Let the warmth take you. Let the story hold you. You are safe here. And so is everything you carry. The second hour begins and you have traveled far. Let any remaining tension in your face soften now, the muscles around your eyes, your jaw, the back of your neck. Simply release. We are going outward tonight, beyond the cities and the archives and the buried windows, into the wider world that the Tartaria theory touches when it reaches its fullest extent. The empire in this telling was not a regional power. It was a planetary one. Come with us. There is nothing to be afraid of here. The global reach of the Tartarian civilization is, for its believers, one of the theory's most important and most difficult claims. It is difficult because it requires explaining how a single civilization could have left its fingerprints on every inhabited continent, how the same architectural forms, the same geometric patterns, the same energy infrastructure could appear in places that the official history of the period places in complete isolation from one another. The believer's answer is not that Tartaria conquered the world in any military sense. It is that Tartaria was the world, or rather, that before the reset, the world was more connected than the official history acknowledges, and that the civilization which occupied that connected world was, in its essential character, Tartarian. The reset did not destroy a regional empire. It destroyed a planetary culture. And the ruins are everywhere if you know how to read them. The Americas occupy a complicated place in the Tartaria theory. The official history of the Western Hemisphere before European contact describes a collection of civilizations ranging from the hunter-gatherer to the highly complex. The Maya, the Aztec, the Inca, the mound builders of North America, all of them understood as having developed independently of the Old World, separated by oceans that were not regularly crossed until the late 15th century. The Tartaria researchers challenge this isolation. The star forts of the Americas, the geometric earthworks and stone fortifications found across both continents, are, in their reading, too similar to those of Europe and Asia to be coincidental. The architectural traditions of the great pre-Columbian civilizations share too many features with those the researchers identify as Tartarian. The oceans, they say, were not barriers. They were roads. And the civilization that traveled them left the same marks on both sides. The ancient city of Agartha, the subterranean civilization that appears in various mystical and esoteric traditions as a hidden world beneath the Earth's surface, intersects with the Tartaria theory in ways that some believers find compelling. The claim is not that Tartaria was literally underground, but that in the aftermath of the reset, certain survivors of the Tartarian civilization retreated into the extensive tunnel and underground chamber systems that the old infrastructure had included, systems that the believers say are documented in fragmentary form in various historical and geological records, and that these hidden remnants of the old world persisted, and perhaps persist still, in the deep places beneath the continents. The underground is, in this telling, not metaphor. It is address. The role of the Orthodox Church in the preservation and concealment of Tartarian knowledge is a thread that runs through the Russian and Eastern European versions of the theory. The great monasteries of the Orthodox tradition, those ancient, fortress-like complexes perched on mountains and islands across Greece, Russia, and the Middle East, are, the believers note, among the oldest continuously inhabited structures in the world, their libraries containing manuscripts that have never been fully catalogued or made publicly available. The believers do not claim to know exactly what those manuscripts contain. They claim to know that the monasteries were built on sites of Tartarian significance, energy nodes, the same locations where the spires and the star forts and the domed energy centers once stood, and that the knowledge of why those sites mattered was carried into the monastic tradition and has been held there, carefully and quietly, ever since. The indigenous peoples of Siberia and Central Asia, the various nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples who have inhabited the heart of what the maps called Tartaria for centuries, carry in their oral traditions, the researchers say, fragments of a memory that the written record has lost. Stories of a former time when the land was different, warmer, more fertile, more inhabited, when great structures stood in places that are now empty steppe, when the sky behaved differently than it does today. These stories are not presented by the indigenous peoples themselves as history in any literal sense. They are myth, cosmology, the deep narrative furniture of a culture. But the believers listen to them the way a geologist listens to the landscape, not for literal truth, but for the shape of something that was once real, preserved in the amber of story. The great fires of the 19th century are another recurring element in the Tartaria theory. The cities of the post-reset world were, the believers note, subject to an extraordinary number of catastrophic fires in the mid to late 19th century. Chicago burned in 1871. Boston burned in 1872. Seattle burned in 1889. San Francisco was devastated in 1906. The official explanations are various: a cow, a lamp, a bakery, a gas main. The believers look at the pattern and see something else: a systematic destruction of the remaining Tartarian infrastructure, carried out under the cover of accidents, removing the physical evidence of the old world from cities that were being aggressively rebuilt in the image of the new one. The fires did not merely destroy buildings. They cleared the ground for replacements that looked superficially similar to what had been there before, but were built without the understanding that had made the originals what they were. The rebuilding that followed the great fires is, in the Tartarian reading, as significant as the fires themselves. In city after city, in the years immediately following a catastrophic fire, construction proceeded at a pace and with a quality of result that the believers find impossible to reconcile with the resources officially available. Chicago, devastated in 1871, was substantially rebuilt within 2 years, rebuilt with buildings of extraordinary ambition and technical achievement, buildings that formed the foundation of what historians now call the Chicago School of Architecture. The Tartarian answer is that the builders were not starting from nothing. They were working with the bones of what had been there before, the foundations, the infrastructure, the underground systems that the fire had not reached. They were not rebuilding. They were resurfacing. And through all of this, through the fires and the rebuilding in the monastery libraries and the underground chambers and the indigenous stories of a different sky, the Tartaria researchers return always to the same central image. A world that was whole, that was connected, that was powered by something freely available to everyone, and that was taken apart deliberately, carefully, and almost completely. Almost. Because the buildings are still there, and the spires are still there, and the geometry of the star forts is still legible from above, and the old maps still say the name in letters large enough to read across a table. Almost completely erased. But not quite. Never quite. The steppe is wide and dark and very quiet. Somewhere beneath it, if the believers are right, the old world is still intact, waiting with the patience of stone for a question large enough to reach it. And you are very still, very warm, very nearly gone into the deep and generous dark of sleep. The fires have been out for a long time. The rebuilding is done. And the world rests as you rest, in the long and unresolved night. Still here. Still breathing. Good. The story is older now. We are deep into the second hour, and the world the believers describe has grown stranger and more intricate with each telling. It has the quality of certain dreams. The more you look at it, the more detail appears, and the detail is always consistent, always pointing in the same direction. Come. There are still questions to ask. And questions at this hour are the gentlest things in the world. The Tartaria theory, at its most expansive, is not really a theory about a lost empire. It is a theory about knowledge, about who has it, who controls it, and what happens to the people who stumble onto the kind that was not meant to be found. The researchers who spend their days in the digital archives and the comments sections and the late-night video essays are not, in their own understanding, hobbyists pursuing an eccentric interest. They are, in their own understanding, doing something that the official institutions of knowledge have failed to do, asking the questions that the evidence actually demands, rather than the questions that the consensus has decided are permissible. Whether they are right about Tartaria is, for the purposes of this quiet hour, less important than the seriousness with which they are wrong or right. They are paying attention. And paying attention is never entirely wasted. The question of what happened to the Tartarian language, or languages, is one that the researchers approach from several directions simultaneously. Some focus on the maps, where place names in the Tartarian territories carry syllables and roots that recur too consistently to be accidental. Others focus on the linguistic traditions of the indigenous peoples of Siberia and Central Asia, finding in the deep structures of their languages patterns that they believe connect to a broader and older linguistic family than conventional linguistics recognizes. And others focus on the decorative traditions, the geometric patterns in the textiles and the stonework and the metalwork, arguing that these are not merely ornamental but linguistic, a visual language encoding information that the reset could not entirely erase because it was woven into objects rather than written on pages that could be burned. The Tartarian understanding of time is, in the theory, fundamentally different from the linear progression that the official history assumes. The believers point to the cyclical cosmologies of the cultures associated with the Tartarian world, the great cycles of ages found in Hindu and Buddhist and Zoroastrian tradition, in the Mayan calendar system, in the Norse concept of recurring world endings and world beginnings, and suggest that these are not merely mythological frameworks but encoded memories of a civilization that understood time differently. The reset in this reading was not an ending but a turning, the close of one great cycle and the forced beginning of another, engineered by people who understood the cycle well enough to exploit it but not well enough or not honestly enough to let it turn naturally. The civilization that replaced Tartaria did not emerge organically from what came before. It was installed, placed into a gap that the cycle had opened, by people who had been waiting for exactly that gap. The number of people who have encountered the Tartaria theory and found it compelling is, by any measure, remarkable. The videos that introduced most people to the subject have accumulated tens of millions of views. The online communities dedicated to its research contain hundreds of thousands of active members. The books and documentary films and podcast episodes it has generated form a substantial and growing body of work. The believers do not take this popularity as proof of anything, they are generally too careful for that. But they take it as evidence of something real, a widespread intuition shared across cultures and demographics and educational backgrounds, that the official story of human history is incomplete, that something is missing, that the world is older and stranger than the version we were given. That intuition may be wrong in its specifics, but it is not, the believers say, wrong in its feeling. The Tartarian theory's relationship to other alternative history traditions is complex and sometimes uneasy. The believers generally distinguish themselves from the ancient aliens community, which attributes the achievements of past civilizations to extraterrestrial intervention, an explanation the Tartaria researchers largely reject, not because they find it implausible in principle but because they find it unnecessary. The achievements of Tartaria, in their reading, do not require aliens. They require only a civilization that was more advanced than the official timeline allows, and a reset that removed the evidence of that advancement. The explanation is human, entirely human, from beginning to end. Which is, in a way, a more unsettling conclusion than the alternative. Aliens are remote and unknowable. The people who carried out the reset, if the theory is correct, were our ancestors. The role of schooling in maintaining the post-reset consensus is a thread the believers trace with particular feeling. The universal public education systems that emerged across Europe and America in the 19th century, the same century as the reset, the same century as the Great Fires and the orphan trains and the World's Fairs, are, in the Tartarian reading, not a gift of literacy to the population. They are a delivery mechanism for the new story. Children who might otherwise have heard fragments of the old world from grandparents who remembered something, or who might have asked the obvious questions about the buried windows and the oversized buildings, were instead placed in rooms and given a version of history so confident and so complete that the questions were answered before they could be asked. The school did not create ignorance. It created a specific and carefully shaped knowledge that left no room for what it needed to exclude. The emotional experience of the Tartaria theory, the way it feels to encounter it and find it compelling, is something the researchers discuss openly and with a self-awareness that is sometimes surprising. They know it is seductive. They know the pattern-making mind is capable of finding connections that are not there. They know that the feeling of having seen through an official deception can be its own kind of intoxication, leading people further and faster than the evidence strictly warrants. The best of the Tartaria researchers hold these cautions alongside their convictions, neither dismissing the questions nor surrendering to the answers more completely than the evidence allows. It is a difficult balance to maintain. But it is, the believers say, the only honest way to sit with a mystery this large and this old. And the mystery is large. It is, in the Tartaria telling, the largest mystery there is. The question of who we actually are, and where we actually come from, and what was actually here before the world we were born into was built over the world that came before. These are not small questions. They are the questions that sit at the bottom of everything, beneath the history and the architecture and the maps and the census records and the orphan trains and the mud. They are the questions that wake people up at 2 in the morning and send them to their screens. And they are, whether the Tartaria theory is right or wrong, genuinely worth asking. Questions. The night is full of them, and they are all perfectly safe to leave unanswered until morning. There is nothing to solve tonight. Nothing to prove or disprove or research or remember. There is only the dark and the slow tide of your breathing, and the long, patient world holding you in its old and complicated arms. You're almost there. Almost. The night is deep and generous now. Let your body be completely heavy. Let your mind be completely empty, or if thoughts come, let them come and go like birds across a still sky, not landing, not staying. We are in the heart of the theory now, the place where the biggest claims live, where the story the believers tell reaches its fullest and most ambitious extent. You don't need to evaluate any of it. You only need to let it move through you like warm air through an open window. Come. A little deeper. Come. The question of what Tartarian daily life actually looked like, what it felt like to be an ordinary person in that civilization, to wake in the morning in a building whose walls hummed quietly with free energy, to walk streets that were clean and wide and lit without fire, is one the researchers approach with a tenderness that is distinct from the rest of their work. The grand claims about the reset and the suppression and the rewritten history have a combative energy and urgency. But the imagining of the daily life has something else, a quality of longing. The believers are not only angry about what was taken. They are genuinely sad about it. They mourn a world they never lived in, a civilization they know only through its buried foundations and its orphaned children and the geometric patterns in its stonework. There is a grief at the heart of the Tartaria theory that is as real as anything else in it. The food of the Tartarian world is imagined by the researchers with surprising specificity. The civilization, they say, had access to plant varieties and agricultural techniques that the post-reset world lost along with everything else. Techniques that produced food of a nutritional density that modern agriculture, with its emphasis on yield over quality, does not approach. The believers point to accounts in old texts of foods that provided extraordinary vitality, of grains and fruits that do not correspond to any modern variety, of dietary practices that the official history of nutrition has no framework to accommodate. The reset, in this telling, did not only impoverish the world energetically and architecturally. It impoverished it nutritionally, replacing a diet of genuine abundance with one of managed sufficiency, giving people enough to work and not enough to thrive. The Tartarian understanding of medicine was, the believers say, correspondingly advanced. Not in the way of modern pharmaceutical medicine, not the isolation of compounds and the targeting of symptoms, but in a more integrated sense, a medicine that understood the human body as an energy system and treated illness as a disruption of that system rather than as an invasion to be fought. The free energy of the Tartarian world was not only used for power and light. It was used therapeutically. The great domed buildings and the resonant stone chambers of the Tartarian tradition were, in this reading, places of healing as much as places of gathering, their electromagnetic and acoustic properties designed to restore the body's natural frequencies in ways that the civilization understood precisely and that modern medicine is only beginning, in certain experimental corners of its practice, to take seriously. The Tartarian relationship with the natural world was, the believers say, fundamentally different from the extractive relationship that the post-reset civilization has with nature. The free energy system did not require the burning of anything. It did not require mining in any destructive sense. It did not require the clearing of forests or the damming of rivers or the fouling of air. The Tartarian civilization existed on the surface of the earth with a lightness that the one that replaced it has never managed. Not because the Tartarians were spiritually superior, the researchers are careful to say, but because their technology made lightness easy in a way that our technology makes it very difficult. The environmental damage of the post-reset world is not, in this telling, an accident or an oversight. It is a structural consequence of the suppression of the free energy system. We burn things because we were not allowed to keep the technology that made burning unnecessary. The children born in the post-reset world, the first generation raised entirely within the new story, educated in the new schools, living in the rebuilt cities, are, in the Tartarian theory, a kind of fulcrum. They were the generation in which the memory broke. Their grandparents or their grandparents' grandparents may have known something, may have carried some fragment of the old world in the form of a story, a practice, a way of looking at a building that they could not have explained but could not quite stop doing. But by the time this first fully post-reset generation grew old and had grandchildren of their own, the thread was gone. The oral tradition that might have preserved something had been replaced by the written tradition of the new schools, and the written tradition said nothing about what had come before, because it had been written by people whose purpose was to ensure that nothing would be said. The forgetting was complete. And the completion of the forgetting was, in its way, the true end of Tartaria. The star forts reappear here in this deeper part of the story in a different light. The believers note that many of the great star forts of Europe and the Americas were constructed, or, in the Tartarian reading, already existed and were claimed, at precisely the moment of the reset, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. They were described, by the new civilization that occupied them, as military installations, defensive structures built to withstand the new artillery of the gunpowder age. But the believers find this explanation inadequate. The geometry of the star fort is not optimal for artillery defense. Military historians have noted this. The geometry is optimal for something else. The distribution of a radial energy field outward from a central point, the way the spokes of a wheel distribute force from the hub. The star forts were not repurposed by the new civilization. They were occupied. Moved into, the way a hermit crab moves into a shell it did not make, and given a new explanation that fit the new story. The artists of the post-reset world are, for the Tartaria researchers, unwitting witnesses. The painters and engravers and early photographers of the 19th century documented what they saw without understanding the significance of what they were capturing. In their images of the grand new cities, of the World's Fair pavilions, of the railway terminals and the opera houses and the public baths, they preserved details that the researchers now read as evidence. The proportions of the buildings, the style of the ornament, the way the light falls on surfaces of materials that behave in the images, differently than the official construction records would suggest. The artists were not conspirators. They were simply looking at what was in front of them. And what was in front of them, the researchers say, was Tartaria, or what was left of it, dressed in the clothes of a new century and presented as the achievement of a civilization that had, in fact, only just arrived. And the rivers. The researchers returned to the rivers as they always do, those great conductors of the Tartarian system, still running, still moving through the landscape with the same patience they have always had. The Mississippi, the Volga, the Danube. The rivers do not know what they have lost. They do not know that the structures that once stood along their banks and drew something from their movement have been gone for a century and a half. They simply run. They carry the rain from the mountains to the sea as they have always done, as they will always do, indifferent and beautiful and full of a purpose that the world above them has mostly forgotten how to use. The rivers run on. The star forts stand in their fields, their geometry perfect and patient and older than the explanations given for them. And you, You are still and warm and very nearly gone, your breathing slow as the turning of a season, your body is heavy and as peaceful as good earth after rain. We have more to tell. It will wait. Sleep is patient. And so, it turns out, is everything worth knowing? We are deep in the second hour now, and you may be drifting in and out. That is exactly right. You don't need to follow every word. Let the words come and go. The story continues whether you hold it closely or let it wash over you like the sound of a river at night. Either way you are resting. Either way you are safe. We are in the territory now where the Tartaria theory touches the present. Where the hidden history becomes, for the believers, not just the past but the explanation for the world we are living in right now. Come. Gently. Come. The transition from the Tartarian world to the one we inhabit did not happen all at once. The believers are careful about this. The reset was catastrophic, but it was not instantaneous. It was a process, carried out over decades, involving the physical destruction of the old infrastructure, the rewriting of the historical record, the installation of new institutions of governance and education and commerce, and the gradual replacement of a population that remembered something with one that did not. This process, the researchers say, was essentially complete by the early 20th century. By the time the First World War began, the world that fought it was already fully the post-reset world. A world that had no living memory of what had come before, that had been born into the new story and knew no other. The war itself, in some versions of the theory, was part of the final consolidation, a catastrophe that finished the work the reset had begun, destroying the last of the old European social structures and replacing them with the modern nation-states that the new civilization required. The Federal Reserve, established in the United States in 1913, is a significant landmark in the Tartarian timeline. The believers note that the creation of a privately controlled central banking system, one that issued currency and set interest rates independently of the democratic government, came at precisely the moment when the post-reset consolidation was being completed. The free energy of Tartaria had made the control of resources difficult. If power is freely available to everyone, the leverage that comes from owning the means of energy production disappears. The new system required the opposite. A world in which everything, including money itself, was issued from a center by people who controlled the issuance, to people who had no choice but to accept it. The Federal Reserve was not, in this telling, a financial institution. It was a capstone. The last piece of an architecture of control whose foundations had been laid in the mud of the reset. The First and Second World Wars occupy a complex place in the Tartaria theory. The believers do not generally claim that the wars were entirely manufactured. They are too careful about the evidence for that kind of sweeping assertion. What they claim is that the conditions that produced the wars were not natural, that the economic arrangements, the political structures, the nationalist ideologies that made the wars possible were themselves products of the post-reset world, installed by the same forces that had carried out the reset, and that the wars served the purpose of accelerating changes that those forces wanted made. The redrawing of maps. The dissolution of old empires. The establishment of new international institutions, the League of Nations and later the United Nations, that concentrated global governance in ways that the old Tartarian world, with its distributed free energy and its autonomous regions, had never allowed. The architecture of the 20th century is, for the Tartaria researchers, a kind of confession. The grand buildings of the Tartarian age, the ones that survived the fires and the demolitions and the general pressure to replace, were, as the century progressed, increasingly surrounded and dwarfed by a new kind of building: the glass and steel tower, the concrete block, the flat-roofed minimalist structure that made no reference to the past, that incorporated no geometric patterns, no copper spires, no resonant domes. The believers do not think this shift in architectural style was purely aesthetic. It was, they say, a continuation of the erasure, the systematic replacement of buildings that embodied the old knowledge with buildings that embodied nothing except the priorities of a civilization organized around the efficient use of space and the minimization of cost. The beauty went out of the buildings. And beauty, in the Tartarian understanding, was never merely decorative. The suppression of Nikola Tesla is, for many people, the entry point into the broader Tartaria theory, and it remains one of its most emotionally resonant threads. Tesla, brilliant, visionary, ultimately ruined, spent the last decades of his life working on the Wardenclyffe Tower project, attempting to demonstrate that electrical power could be transmitted wirelessly through the Earth and the atmosphere to receivers anywhere in the world. His funding was withdrawn. His tower was demolished. He died in a hotel room in New York, largely forgotten by the scientific establishment, his papers seized by the government immediately after his death. The believers do not find this sequence of events surprising. Tesla had come too close to the thing that the post-reset world most needed to keep hidden. The free energy of Tartaria was the secret whose exposure would unravel everything. The banking system, the oil economy, the entire architecture of resource control that the reset had been carried out to establish. Tesla had to be stopped. And he was. The oil economy deserves its own moment in this telling. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of the petroleum industry, the discovery, extraction, and sale of oil as the primary energy source of the modern world. The believers note that this rise happened at precisely the moment when the Tartarian free energy infrastructure was being finally dismantled, as though the new energy system was installed to fill the gap left by the deliberate destruction of the old one. The timing is, for the researchers, too precise to be accidental. The oil economy did not emerge because oil was the best available energy source. It emerged because oil was the energy source that could be owned, metered, and sold, the energy source that was most compatible with a world organized around the control of resources by a small number of people who had carried out a reset for exactly that purpose. The Internet is, for the Tartaria community, a deeply ambivalent technology. It is the medium through which the theory has spread, through which the researchers have found each other, shared their findings, built the communities and the archives and the video libraries that have made Tartaria a global conversation rather than a local curiosity. Without the Internet, Tartaria would still be a marginal and scattered set of questions asked by isolated individuals with no way to connect their observations. The Internet made the community possible. But the believers are aware that the Internet is also a tool of the same forces that carried out the reset, that it can be used to monitor, to manage, to quietly suppress what needs suppressing while allowing enough to circulate to give the appearance of free inquiry. The researchers navigate this ambivalence without resolving it. They use the tool that is available. They know who built it, and they keep asking their questions anyway. And the world outside the theory, the world most people live in without any awareness of Tartaria or the reset or the buried buildings or the orphan trains, continues on. People go to work and come home and feed their children and watch the news and argue about politics and fall asleep in front of screens. They walk past the old buildings without looking up at the copper spires. They drive over the buried ground floors without knowing what is beneath them. They live, in the Tartarian reckoning, in a story that was written for them by people who had reasons for writing it that way, and they have no particular reason to doubt the story because it is the only one they have ever been given. The believers do not, mostly, look down on these people. They remember being them. They remember the moment before the first anomaly cracked something open. And they know that the crack, once made, cannot be unmade. The world turns. The oil burns. The glass towers rise above the buried spires. And you are very, very nearly asleep now, if you are not already. That is the best thing. Sleep. The story will keep. The questions will keep. Everything worth keeping keeps. And you are safe and warm and held, and the long night has you gently in its hands. If you are still with us, you are doing beautifully. And if you have drifted away and come back, that is also beautiful. Sleep comes in waves sometimes, and there is no wrong way to rest. We are in the final chapters now. The theory has brought us all the way to the present, to the world we actually live in, the streets we actually walk, the buildings we actually inhabit. The believers say that Tartaria is not only history. It is here now, underneath everything. Come. One more time. Come. The world the Tartaria researchers describe when they look at the present is not a world of despair. It is, and this is perhaps the most surprising thing about the theory for those who encounter it expecting only darkness, a world of extraordinary latent possibility. The free energy is still there. The Earth's electromagnetic field has not been switched off. The principles that the Tartarian civilization understood and applied have not ceased to be true simply because the civilization that understood them was destroyed. The knowledge was suppressed, not annihilated. And suppressed knowledge, the believers say, has a way of surfacing, slowly, in fragments, through the work of people who stumble onto it without knowing what they have found, the way Tesla stumbled onto it, the way the researchers themselves stumbled onto the buried windows and the orphan trains and the maps with the great names sprawling across them. The alternative energy researchers of the present day, the people working in garages and small laboratories on devices that their funders and their colleagues and their governments regard with various degrees of skepticism and hostility, are, in the Tartarian telling, the inheritors of a tradition that is much older than they know. They are not inventing. They are remembering. The principles they are working toward were understood by a civilization that implemented them at a global scale, and the reason those principles are so difficult to demonstrate within the current scientific framework is not that they are wrong but that the framework itself was built to exclude them. The mainstream of physics and electrical engineering was constructed, in the post-reset period, in a way that made the Tartarian understanding of energy literally unthinkable within its terms. The researchers working outside that mainstream are not cranks. They are archaeologists, digging toward something real. The healing traditions that survive outside the mainstream of modern medicine, the various practices of energy healing, of sound therapy, of the therapeutic use of electromagnetic frequencies, are, in the Tartarian reading, fragments of the old medical knowledge, preserved in the same way that the geometric patterns were preserved in the textiles, by being embedded in practice rather than in text, passed from practitioner to practitioner through demonstration rather than through documents, that could be burned or suppressed. The believers do not claim that all alternative medicine is Tartarian in origin. They claim that the impulse behind it, the understanding of the human body as an energy system that can be addressed through energy, is genuinely ancient, genuinely sophisticated, and genuinely suppressed by a medical establishment that was built, like the physics establishment, to exclude it. The movement toward decentralized energy, toward solar panels and wind turbines and the various technologies that allow individuals and communities to generate their own power rather than purchasing it from a centralized supplier, is watched by the Tartaria researchers with a particular kind of interest. It is not, they say, the recovery of the Tartarian system. It is something different, something that works within the post-reset paradigm of resource ownership rather than transcending it. But it is movement in the right direction, a gradual weakening of the centralized energy control that the reset established, a slow and partial return toward the condition in which power is something you have rather than something you buy. The believers find this encouraging without finding it sufficient. The goal is not cheaper electricity. The goal is the restoration of something that was taken. The growing interest in history that does not fit the official account, the expanding audience for alternative archaeology, for the study of anomalous ancient structures, for the questions raised by sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which pushed the official timeline of complex civilization back by thousands of years when it was excavated in the 1990s, is, for the Tartaria community, a sign of something shifting in the broader culture. The official story is losing its grip. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that all long-held certainties eventually loosen, through the accumulation of anomalies that the story cannot accommodate, through the growing number of people who have noticed the buried windows and cannot unnotice them. The researchers do not expect a sudden official acknowledgement of the reset. They do not expect a press conference at which the suppression of free energy is formally admitted. What they expect is something slower and more interesting, a gradual expansion of what is considered thinkable, until the questions they are asking become questions that anyone can ask without being dismissed. The children growing up today, the generation being raised with the internet as a native environment, with access to the full archive of human knowledge and speculation and dissent at their fingertips from the age at which they can hold a tablet, are, the believers say, a different kind of human animal than any that has existed in the post-reset period. They have not been successfully enclosed within the official story in the way that previous generations were, because the official story no longer has a monopoly on the channels through which stories are told. The schools still teach the standard history. But the children come home and watch videos that ask different questions, and they are not, as previous generations were, without recourse. They can look things up. They can find the maps with the great name on them. They can zoom in on the photographs of the World's Fair buildings and ask the question that the researchers have always asked: how? The answer the official story gives is no longer the only answer available. And once there is more than one available answer, the world is already changing. The researchers themselves, the people who have spent years or decades in the digital archives, building the body of work that constitutes the Tartaria community's collective investigation, are, as they age, beginning to think about what they are leaving behind. The question of legacy is one they discuss with a seriousness that is touching. They know they may not live to see the suppression lifted, if it is ever lifted. They know the official acknowledgement they seek may not come in their lifetimes, or their children's lifetimes. But they keep working. They keep uploading the videos and writing the posts and zooming in on the photographs and asking the questions. Because the work of bearing witness to a possibility, of keeping a question alive that the consensus has decided should be dead, is in itself worth doing. It does not require vindication to be meaningful. It only requires honesty and persistence, and the refusal to look away from a buried window just because looking down makes other people uncomfortable. And somewhere tonight, in a city whose streets are laid at a level 2 meters higher than the floors of its oldest buildings, someone is walking home in the dark and happens to glance down at a window that sits just barely above the pavement, its glass thick and old and faintly greenish in the lamplight, and they stop. They have walked past this window 100 times. But tonight they stop. They crouch down and look through the glass into the room below, a room with a high ceiling and proportions that feel somehow wrong for a basement, that feel like they were designed for a different relationship to the ground than the ground currently has. And something opens in them. A question. Simple and old and impossible to close once it has been opened. What was here before? And who decided I shouldn't know? The window glows faintly in the dark street. The question hangs in the cold air above it, patient and unresolved and perfectly safe to leave that way until morning. You do not need to answer it tonight. You do not need to answer anything tonight. There is only the dark and your breathing and the long and generous fact of rest. The universe is very old and very patient, and it has nowhere to be. And neither do you. We have come a very long way together. From the first maps with the great names sprawling across them, through the buried buildings and the copper spires and the mud flood and the orphan trains and the star forts and the suppressed inventors and the rivers that still run with a purpose the world above them has forgotten. We arrive now at the end, or rather, not the end because this story has no end, any more than a buried room has an end. It simply continues, downward, in the dark, waiting for the next person to press their face against the glass. One final segment and then sleep. In this world, the world the Tartaria researchers describe when they look around at the present moment, the year 2025 looks something like this. The grand buildings of the Tartarian age are still standing in cities across the planet, their copper spires green with age, their domed ceilings still gathering whatever it is they were built to gather, their buried ground floors still intact beneath the streets that rose around them. The maps that carry the great name are still in the archives, still available to anyone who thinks to look. The rivers still run. The star forts still hold their perfect geometry against the sky. The free energy of the Earth's electromagnetic field still moves through the ground and the atmosphere, available and unharvested, the way a spring runs under a city that has forgotten it is there and built its water system somewhere else entirely. The people who know about Tartaria number in the millions now. They are on every continent. They speak dozens of languages. They come from every background and every level of formal education. They are united not by certainty, the best of them are careful about certainty, but by a question. The same question that the researchers have always asked in one form or another, since the first person looked at a buried window and felt the ground shift slightly beneath their assumptions. What was here before? What was taken? And is it possible, not certain, not proven, but possible, that the world we were given is not the only world there is, and that somewhere beneath it, patient as stone, the older world is waiting? The answer the Tartaria theory offers is not paradise. The believers are not, for the most part, utopians. The Tartarian civilization was human, and all human things carry their shadows, their hierarchies and their cruelties and their blind spots and their failures. The free energy did not make everyone equal. The grand buildings were not available to everyone in the same way. The reset was carried out by human beings, which means that human beings were capable of it, capable of that scale of destruction and concealment and deliberate forgetting. That is not a comforting thing to know about our species. But it is, the believers say, an important thing. Because if human beings were capable of carrying out the reset, human beings are capable of undoing it. Not quickly. Not easily. Not without resistance from the forces that have spent a century and a half maintaining the new story. But capable. The species that built Tartaria and the species that destroyed it are the same species. And that means the species that rebuilds it, or builds something new from the fragments that remain, is also the same species. Here. Now. The moon, in certain versions of the Tartaria theory, is not incidental to the story. The believers note that the Tartarian architectural tradition appears to have been deeply attentive to lunar cycles, that the placement of the great energy centers, the orientation of the domed buildings, the timing of the civic ceremonies that the old calendar prescribed, all showed a relationship to the moon's position and phase that goes beyond the agricultural and navigational uses that conventional history assigns to lunar observation. The moon in this telling was not merely a clock. It was a component, a body whose gravitational and electromagnetic relationship with the Earth was understood by Tartarian science and incorporated into the energy system in ways that modern physics has not yet fully mapped. The tides move because of the moon. The believers ask what else moves invisibly for the same reason. The colors of the Tartarian world are a detail the researchers linger on with particular affection. The buildings of the Tartarian tradition were not, they say, the gray and brown of weathered stone that we see today. They were vivid, faced with materials that reflected light in ways that made the cities luminous, that made the great civic spaces glow on overcast days as though lit from within. The white of the World's Fair buildings was not paint. It was a surface treatment whose precise composition the post-reset world did not preserve, the way it did not preserve the concrete formula or the energy principles or the agricultural techniques. The color went out of the world along with everything else. And the cities we inhabit today, their stone darkened by a century of industrial air, their surfaces dull where the old ones shone, are, in the Tartarian reckoning, a faded copy of something that was once genuinely radiant. The gardens of the Tartarian world are another detail the researchers reconstruct from fragments. The great public gardens that appear in old engravings and early photographs of the 19th century cities, gardens of an ambition and a geometric intricacy that seems, to the believers, disproportionate to the resources officially available for their creation, were not, in the Tartarian reading, merely decorative. The Tartarian understanding of plant life was connected to the same principles that govern the architecture and the energy system. Certain plants, arranged in certain geometric relationships to one another and to the buildings around them, participated in the electromagnetic network, not as passive ornaments but as living components, their root systems and their canopies and the moisture they moved through the soil all contributing to a system whose full complexity the post-reset world has never mapped. The gardens were not gardens. They were circuits. And they were, like everything else, allowed to go wild. The relationship between the Tartarian energy system and water is something the believers return to with a consistency that suggests they find it genuinely important and genuinely difficult to explain. Water, in the Tartarian understanding, was not merely a resource to be transported and consumed. It was a medium, a carrier of the electromagnetic information that the civilization's infrastructure processed and distributed. The great fountains and the aqueducts and the elaborate public baths of the Tartarian tradition were not separate systems serving separate purposes. They were aspects of a single integrated network in which water moved through the city the way blood moves through a body, doing work at every point along its path, arriving at its destinations charged with something that the people who used it received without knowing they were receiving it. The water of the post-reset world, chlorinated, pressurized, delivered through plastic pipes, is, in this telling, the same element rendered inert. Still wet. No longer alive in the way that it was. The mirrors and reflective surfaces that appear with unusual frequency in the decorative traditions of the Tartarian architectural style are another detail the researchers examine closely. The elaborate use of gold leaf, of polished metal, of highly reflective stone in the interiors of the grand buildings is not, in the Tartarian reading, mere opulence. Reflective surfaces in the free energy system served a function analogous to the function of mirrors in optical systems, directing and concentrating the electromagnetic field within a space, bouncing it between surfaces in ways that increased its density and its effect on the people inside. The gilded ceiling was not a display of wealth. It was an antenna. And the people who sat beneath it, in the great halls and the civic chambers and the concert rooms of the Tartarian world, were sitting inside a device whose purpose was their own enhancement, their own energetic restoration, carried out so seamlessly and so continuously that they would no more have noticed it than a fish notices the water. The Tartarian understanding of sleep itself is, for the researchers, a quietly fascinating thread. A civilization that understood the human body as an energy system, and that had designed its built environment to support and restore that system, would have understood sleep differently than the post-reset world does, not as a passive absence of wakefulness but as an active process of energetic restoration, during which the body drew on the electromagnetic field of the earth in ways that the Tartarian architecture was specifically designed to support. The orientation of sleeping rooms, the materials of the beds, the relationship between the sleeping body and the earth beneath the building. All of these, in the Tartarian understanding, mattered in ways that the post-reset world, with its concrete floors and its electromagnetic noise and its artificial light that tells the body the sun has not set, has entirely lost track of. The researchers find a particular poignancy in this. The thing that the Tartarian world understood about sleep, and that the post-reset world does not, is precisely what this hour is about. Rest is not nothing. Rest is work, the oldest and most necessary kind. The dreams of the people who live above the buried rooms are, in the most poetic versions of the Tartaria theory, not entirely their own. The electromagnetic field that the Tartarian infrastructure generated did not switch off when the reset came. It diminished as the towers and the domes and the star forts were taken out of active use, but it did not disappear. The Earth's own field continued, and the structures that had been built to interact with it continued to interact with it in their passive, unpowered way, the way a radio antenna still has a shape even when it is not connected to a receiver. The people who sleep above these structures, in the apartments above the buried ground floors, in the houses built on the sites of demolished Tartarian buildings, in the cities whose streets run directly over the old foundations, are, in this telling, still faintly within range of something. Not enough to power a light. Not enough to heat a room. But perhaps enough, on certain nights, in certain conditions of the atmosphere, to influence the quality of what happens in the dark behind closed eyes. The researchers do not claim to know what Tartarian dreams were like. They only note that the field is still there, and that the sleeping mind is, of all the states the human consciousness inhabits, the one most open to what it cannot name. The final image the Tartaria researchers return to, when they want to convey what the theory means to them at its deepest level, is not the grand one. It is not the soaring dome or the star fort seen from above or the great name on the old map. It is the small one. It is the buried window. The rectangle of old glass sitting just above the pavement of an ordinary street in an ordinary city, looking into a room that the city above it does not acknowledge and cannot explain. That window is real. You can find windows like it in dozens of cities. You can crouch down in front of one and press your face against the glass and look into the room below and ask the question that the room asks back at you with its impossible proportions and its high ceiling and its absolute silence. What was here? Who lived here? Where did they go? And why was I never told? Those questions do not need answers tonight. They are patient questions. They have been waiting under the street for 150 years, and they can wait a little longer. What matters at this hour, in this darkness, is not the answer but the asking, The willingness to crouch down in front of the buried window and look, to take seriously the possibility that the ground is deeper than the official story says, that the world is older and stranger and more layered than the version we were handed, that somewhere beneath the history we were taught, another history is lying quietly in the dark, its proportions wrong for a basement, its ceiling too high, its silence. The particular silence of something that has been waiting a very long time to be found. You have been such a patient and generous listener. The Empire thanks you. The researchers thank you. The buried rooms thank you in their quiet way. Let the dark take you now, warm and complete and untroubled. The maps are in the archives. The rivers are running. The star forts are holding their geometry against the night sky with a patience that makes human patience look brief. And somewhere, a child is falling asleep in a building whose ground floor is not quite where it should be, in a city that has forgotten what it is standing on, in a world that is older than it knows. The child does not know any of this. The child is simply falling asleep as children have always done, as you are doing now, carried down into the dark on the slow and generous tide of a story that has no ending, only the next question and the one after that, waiting in the deep and patient ground below. Good night.